Well, thank you very much, Mary, for this wonderful introduction, which catches a lot of my work very deeply. And I'm very happy to be here today. And especially thank you to Mary and Rosalie for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to present some of my work. So I'm going to talk about neoliberalizing as a sort of dynamic discourse and how this has had an impact on the emerging care crisis in the Nordic welfare states. And this is then the way I've framed the sort of structure of my talk. So first I present my argument, then I'll sort of dwell briefly into what the Nordic welfare states are for those who are not familiar with that concept and say a little bit about differences. Then I'll go into the concept of care and the care crisis, hopefully contributing to conceptual clarification. And then I go into the issue of neoliberalizing in the Nordic welfare state. And I look briefly at consequences of a care crisis at a micro and macro level. And finally, I, of course, conclude. So I'll start my presentation by saying that the Nordic welfare states are usually seen as very caring welfare states with generous universal care services for preschool children, elderly sick people, but also people with disabilities. And generous services are usually perceived as formalized, paid care that is of good or of high quality. And the Nordics are seen as states that are usually interpreted as tax-financed universal care that is available, affordable, but also accessible for those in need of services temporarily or more permanently. So my work today here is presenting something on creches, kindergartens, how elderly care is taking place in private homes of elderly, but also in nursing home. And when I talk about care here today in relation to the emerging care crisis, I'm talking about care as paid work and care that is professionalized. And when I use the concept of professionalized, I refer to people who've been trained in either vocational schools or in university colleges between 2 to 4 years, just so you have a sort of understanding what professionalized care is here. So the Nordic welfare states are perceived as places where we wouldn't expect a care crisis to occur. Actually, they're very unlikely candidates for a care crisis. In fact, they're actually the most unlikely cases for a care crisis to occur because they're supposed to have these universal generous care. However, today I'll argue that they're actually indeed a care crisis brewing even in the Nordic welfare state. Because in one of the a recent book we published, we actually investigated old age care, preschool care, and also care in hospitals. And we saw among care professionals that there was an increasing intensification of work. People were running faster, doing more and more within a lesser amount of time. So there was intensification of work. But there was also the fact that care was becoming increasingly physically and emotionally sort of more strenuous. There was moral distress, but there was also increasingly care professionals considering quitting. So politically also care has been reframed, and I'll get back to that later, and where we see that some needs are being depoliticized, but also that some care needs are being silenced. And in that, I'll actually argue that care in the Nordic welfare states is actually turning into postmodern cold care. However, to understand the contours of this brewing care crisis, we need to look at the concept of care, but also at the concept of care crisis itself. So we need to look at the care crisis as not just having one dimension, but that care crisis is actually having two dimensions, that care crisis is actually more complex phenomenon than imagined. But let us then briefly just look at the Nordic welfare state when we sort of, before we go to the concept of care and the care crisis. So when we talk about the Nordic welfare states, there are usually two aspects that are sort of highlighted in the culture, in the literature. One is the universalism, that there is sort of tax finance rights to receive care and also to some extent to actually be able to give care. So care is sort of, in this sense, universal in the sense that it's accessible to all as rights, but also that nearly everyone or almost everyone is actually using the care services. So that's the universalist element. And the quality of care, or it's supposed to be not just meager care, but it's supposed to be quality care, so to speak. So the Nordic welfare states are usually seen as caring state with sufficient and quality care available. There are also states which has a particularly care and gender compromise between the division of labor between states and families. And this care compromise is a particular kind of feminism where there is tax-financed, universal, but also generous care that supports a dual breadwinner model. And when I talk about a dual breadwinner model, I'm talking about cohabiting married partners who work full-time or very long part-time. And they do that continuously throughout their lifespan. So they're not opting in and out of the labor market, but staying in the labor market from when they enter it. And when I talk about the Nordic welfare states, as you see, I sort of highlighted the plural here. It's because I want to underscore the often disregarded differences both within, but also between the 5 Nordic states, because they're often humbled or put together in a sort of homogenizing sort of picture. So what we also know from research is that neoliberalism has been translated in 2 different versions. In a lightweight version, but also in a more fully fledged neoliberalist version. So we have Norway and Denmark on one hand, which has sort of adopted a neoliberalism light, like in Diet Coke, so to speak. And we have Sweden and Finland, who has adopted a much stronger kind of neoliberalism with a much stronger emphasis on marketization, downsizing, and offloading care to self-care and significant others. And this is well known from the literature, at least in old age care. So these differences give a distinct form for the care crisis in various countries, especially when we talk about a care crisis beyond the liberal welfare state. And I'll get back to this concept of the liberal welfare state in relation to the care crisis. Now, marketization takes many forms. And marketization forms different kinds of care in different ways. If we look at nursing homes in Norway and Denmark, approximately 90 to 92% of nursing homes and the number of beds in nursing homes are still run by municipalities. That is very surprising, even for me. I would have thought that the number would be much lower than the municipalities would actually run. So the remaining 8 to 10% is split between outsourced care that is either sort of self-governing nursing homes that are sort of non-profit, or less than 5% that are actually for-profit nursing homes. So in that sense, we don't see a major marketization of nursing homes in Norway and Denmark, where we know there is neoliberalism light. However, what this teaches us is that we need to pay much more attention to context and the role of the state, and also that neoliberalizing is not just about marketization, but neoliberalizing is much more. It's also something that happens within the state and also changes the Nordic welfare state from within. And I'll get back to that and elaborate that. So we need to understand what is actually happening within the Nordic welfare states when neoliberalizing is actually meeting the universalist ethos of the Nordic welfare state. And it meets us at both the national level, but also at the level of municipalities, because the municipalities are key elements in the delivery of care services. So summarizing, we need to pay much more attention to the kind of welfare regime. Is it a liberal welfare regime, a social democratic welfare regime, or what kind of regime is it? And what happens inside the state, and the kind of strategies also that the state is pursuing in order to reduce what they see or don't see as an emerging care crisis. So I'll now go into the feminist literature, which is sort of theorizing the care crisis. So when I use the concept of a care crisis, I use it as an analytical term. That is a kind of diagnosis, sort of macro picture of the current situation from a social scientific point of view. So I use the concept of the care crisis regardless of whether policymaker or the elites actually define it as a care crisis or not. For me, it's an analytical term. Right? So using the concept of a care crisis, doesn't mean that everything was better or that there was always sufficient and good care around in the good old days. A crisis rhetoric often includes an image of a golden past where things functioned well and normally. And we also know that to sort of use the concept of a care crisis sort of involves a past-present view. Although we also know from feminist literature that that past was not necessarily glorious or a country of milk and honey. Feminist historians like Janet Finch has long time ago deconstructed our image of a glorious past. So there is no glorious past of care. So how can we understand a care crisis with this in mind? And then I'll just briefly look at two feminist understandings of a care crisis. We can first look at one of the very popular recent books about a care crisis. We can look at Nancy Fraser's understanding of a care crisis. She just a couple of years ago published a book with this very interesting title, Cannibal Capitalism, where she looks at care crisis as, and I quote, widespread social exhaustion and time poverty. Widespread social exhaustion and time poverty. So Fraser believes that capitalism is not just an economic system, it's a social system, and actually also a particular form of capitalism, which she calls, in line with the recent literature, a financialized capitalism that sort of creates a monster of a care guzzler. Cannibal capitalism, in her view, relies on cheap and free care from its success in formal care. But on the other hand, social care and social reproduction actually destabilizes a greedy capitalism. So instead of looking at a contradiction as the Marxist would do, as a sort of concern about ownership of production forces, she looks at it as a key contradiction between production and reproduction. So care and gender is at the core of the tensions within Nancy Fraser's theory. So this capitalist system creates a permanent sort of tension between production and reproduction, but it also generates this time poverty in general in the whole system. There are also other people who have theorized the care crisis. Notably, there is Emma Dowling, a sociologist, who has written about the liberal welfare regime of the UK, of the United Kingdom. And she, in her book, The Care Crisis, she argues that the care crisis in the UK is caused by underfunding of the state and by neoliberalizing practices. That means marketization and financialization. So her focus is upon what kind of resources are available for care, but also the kind of economic system. So Fraser and Dowling, gives us important insights on the care crisis. Insights that I would argue could benefit from some nuance. Fraser and Dowling provide knowledge from a specific context based in a specific contract, respectively the UK, studying the UK, and based in the US, that of a liberal welfare state. And that, I think, somehow frames their understanding of the care crisis. So these current theorizations, and I've given you two examples, they understand a care crisis as a question of not sufficient care. That is the extent of care. That is the quantitative dimension, inadequate resources for care. So in their theorizing, I would argue that their understanding of care is one-dimensional. It's sort of a flat understanding or theorizing of care. However, in my understanding, care is a more complex phenomena. And here I get back to what Mary said in the introduction, that hopefully this would also enlighten us and give some clarification. So I'm just elaborating on my own view of what care is. So in my view, care is complex. It has three dimensions. It has emotional dimensions, it has cognitive dimension, and it has practical dimensions. You can think of it as hands, heart, and head as a sort of tri-dimensional view of care. So care is emotional. Why is care emotional? It's because it requires empathy, it requires attention, but it also requires emotional labor by those actually doing the care, that they can actually turn their mood or find the right attitude or the right emotion to actually be in the care situation. Care is also cognitive. It requires knowledge about particular persons. It also requires knowledge about normal development versus also decay of people. It also requires knowledge about sicknesses and emerging sicknesses. So knowledge can take many forms. It can be formalized knowledge obtained in educational institutions, vocational training, and non-formalized knowledge acquired through the experience, the day-to-day interaction with people in need of care. You can also obtain knowledge through peer-to-peer training, but also knowledge of particular person or particular frail bodies. So care is emotional, it's cognitive, but it's also practical. It's about doing the care in a dialogue with the person in need, or at least in attention to the bodily responses to what you're doing. So care has these three dimensions, but care also takes place in practices that we can map and we can describe, but it also sort of involves existential elements. It involves existential elements of identity and belonging. Who am caring for me? Who am I caring for? What kind of community or what kind of nation is caring or non-caring? So there are these existential elements about care as well. And then finally, and I know it's a long, but it's responding to this quest for clarification. Care is, of course, also governed. It's governed by states, municipalities, but also by organizations. So in this sense, care is also about particular ideas, but also ideals about good care. It's about rights, and it's also about resources. And this governance is, of course, something that travels into different contexts, but also is translated into various contexts and sometimes meets resistance. Right. So because care is so complex, we've sort of theorized it as a care crisis having two dimensions, a quantitative and a qualitative. So it's about inadequate resources for care, but it's also the absence of good enough care. And as you see, it's my co-author, Liselotte Hansen, and I who sort of suggested this different definition of a care crisis. So to identify a care crisis, we need to look at both elements. So we need to look at those in need at the receiving end of care, but we also need to look at the characteristics of care. Is there neglect? Is there bad care or care failure? Is there good enough care or even good care? So to cover this quantitative element of care, we have resorted to the British sociologist Fiona Williams and her concept of good enough care, which is a kind of minimum requirement of what constitutes acceptable care. In most current political discourses about good care, this is framed as an issue of quality. However, I'm very skeptical of the concept of quality. Why? Because the concept of quality is an overdetermined, empty signifier. I mean, who doesn't want quality? We all want quality, right? So in this political administrative discourse, quality can be achieved in two ways, either by looking at the customers, are they satisfied or not, indicated by user evaluations. And the other way to actually achieve quality care is by implementing standards of quality based upon a belief in that you can actually govern care step by step, what I would call processual quality, so that in the various envisioned steps of care are assumed to be predictable, but also controllable. So this concept of quality in the discourse is biased, I would argue, because it conceives of good care as something that can be governed in a particular process. If every step of care is done according to a particular standard, a particular protocol, then the result is good care. So the logic runs. So this way of thinking about good care or qualitative care actually moves the actual care in the background and fails to take account of what the state is governing. If we return to the feminist literature of care, most of feminists actually argue that good care is complex, it's unpredictable, it's contingent, and it also takes place in various institutional contexts. So in my view, good enough care cannot be sort of measured by evaluations or standards, as these instruments can't really take account of the constantly changing needs and the complexity and the contingency of interpersonal interactions and the actual differing or different context where care is created and reproduced. And we also know that ideas about good care changes in context. I mean, perhaps the idea of good care is different in a Nordic context from an Italian context. So different ideals and different ideas. So how can we decide what a level of good enough care is? Who decides? Is it the professional carer? Is it the recipient of care? Or is it us, the researchers, that decide what is good enough care? So I would argue that good enough care refers to a kind of care that is sufficiently attentive to the care needs that are not taken as given or predetermined because they would have to be decided in the situation. So good enough care entails that the care professional feels that she or he has provided good enough care as well as the recipient of care. So good enough care requires that we consider also the working conditions. We need to consider and be attentive to caring for the carer. In this dual interlinked perspective, good enough care can only be provided when care professionals / care workers have sufficient resources to provide care for themselves, but also good enough care for others. And when I talk about resources, it's sort of a very sloppy concept. I think in terms of time, but also emotional energy, knowledge, and also practical abilities. Think back when you last were in an airplane. What are you always told when you're sitting in an airplane? You're always told to put on your oxygen mask before you put it on the child. So when there is an airplane that loses cabin pressure, you cannot help an infant with oxygen if you haven't yourself put on an oxygen mask. And this is also true for care, right? The carer or the care professional needs to care for him or herself and put on the oxygen mask first. So I would argue that the work conditions of the professional care is one of the important conditions to good care. Others would argue that we should aim for the best care and not just accept good enough care. But as some political theorists, as Joan Tronto, but also crib theory has argued, we should not aim for perfect care. Perfect care can be dangerous because it has a dark side. Instead, we should opt for making things better. And making things better can be achieved by being attentive to others, their care needs, and making judgments about good enough care. Yeah. So good enough care is also about what happens in institutional context where care is increasingly split up between different carers and care professionals, and also where there isn't sufficient continuity or we get fragmented care. So I'm just going to summarize this point before I go on to the neoliberalizing element. So summarizing Fraser and Darling, they bring important insights to our understanding of the care crisis based in a particular context or studying liberal welfare states. And I've tried, together with a colleague, to nuance and bring some nuance to this discussion by stressing the qualitative elements. And that looking at the good enough care, we need to focus both on how the persons in need of care perceive the care, but also those who actually perform the care, how they experience the care, and whether they're satisfied with the care that they actually deliver. So now I will go to the next point, which is about neoliberalization in the Nordic welfare state and how it meets the existing universalism. So a lot has been written on neoliberalizing in the Nordic welfare states. I see neoliberalizing as a process and a dynamic discourse that sort of meets the existing institution, values, and ways of thinking. And it's a discourse that meets universalism and transforms both universalism, but where universalism is also vice versa, having an impact on the way neoliberalism is sort of having an effect. Yeah. So when I talk about neoliberalizing, it's hardly a new way of thinking, because what we also witness currently is that new public governance and collaborative governance is actually slowly entering not just our vocabularies, but also the realities of care. And it enters the vocabulary with concepts such as co-creation, trust, and autonomy. And what we currently see in Norway and Denmark is a lot of experiments about how to organize and think about care. So let me go to what happens when the political discourse of neoliberalism meets universalism. So at this meeting were neoliberalizing sort of meets universalism, universalism adapts and sort of contributes to a standardized, reformulated, but also instrumentalized form of care. So the neoliberal discourse focusing upon measuring performance and quality, and it tries to ensure good care through standardizing the various elements of care. It sort of splits care into smaller bits and to functions that can be assessed and measured. So in this way that care is instrumentalized, children are sort of turned into a social investment, and older people are turned into active aging people. So care increasingly becomes something that is not to be achieved for its own sake, but for something outside of care. So care is something that is done in order to achieve other aims. So care is being revamped as some kind of self-care, or as also as a social investment. So instead of direct hands-on care, care has been reformulated as a more indirect form of coaching of both the elderly to become more active and do more care themselves. And it also sort of brings this active aging and self-help to the core of care, with concepts such as self-care, which is actually a contradiction in terms, and the concept of reablement. So those concepts become increasingly key to the care for old age care. So when we are arguing in our edited book that there is currently a brewing care crisis, we are arguing that there is both less care, but also not sufficiently good enough care provided. And at the same time, we see this decreasing universalism, a limited universalism. We see fewer people receiving care, and the hours that they get are also far lesser. So eligibility criteria are tightened and tasks are downloaded to both elderly people themselves, but also to families, significant others, and to voluntaries and civil society. So care needs are reframed and instrumentalized. So if we turn our gaze to what happens inside the state, we see that neoliberalism sort of changes 4 elements within care. It changes the identities of those providing the care professionals. They are increasingly thought to become coaches and trainers. And those who are actually receiving the care are increasingly supposed to do more care themselves, or to become active, or to coach themselves. And so it also changes the amount and characteristics of care. And I would argue that care is sort of translated, or has been translated, into a logic of details, a sort of micromanagement, where there is little time and little discretion left to professionals. So instead of focusing upon the child or the older person, care professionals increasingly direct their attention to follow rules, follow guidelines, follow protocols, but also to document that they're doing good care. So one could say, instead of doing good care, they're writing about doing good care. So there is what the political scientists would call a goal displacement. So due to this logic, there is actually less time for doing the care, because there is more writing, there is more following standardized care. So care is actually here governed by 2 paradigms, and we can go into that this later, not just the neoliberal paradigm of governance, but of course also a pre-existing bureaucratic one, where the bureaucratic paradigm of governance is supposed also to ensure the social democratic welfare state and ensure equality of all, so to speak. So So these two paradigms creates this self-responsibilizing, where responsibility is increasingly brought towards the individual subject itself, where they must increasingly learn how to care for themselves. So I was saying that this discourse has sort of reframed care, but it has also, to a certain extent, silenced some elements of care. There are elements of social care, like having tea, having biscuits, or being attentive to the mood of the elderly person or the crying child in the playground. Those elements of care are increasingly pushed outwards of social policies, in the sense that they're actually increasingly either depoliticized or silenced. And that happens to various elements of care, so to speak. So while these needs are reframed and some needs are silenced, our general argument is that the Nordic welfare state doesn't really care sufficiently for its carers. It sort of takes them for granted, for given. I mean, despite the fact that it's actually educated them and so on. Because what happens within the welfare state is that care professionals and care workers increasingly experience dilemmas of time. And they use various time strategies to actually make ends meet. Sometimes they postpone care needs because there is simply not time. Sometimes they actually work on different tasks simultaneously. So what the care professionals actually do is that they function as a buffer between the welfare state and the specific care needs. They're sort of stretching time, and doing a little extra. However, being in a position as a buffer is not a viable long-term strategy. Because what happens in the long run is that care professional increasingly experiences intensification of care, but they also increasingly experience what can be called a compassion fatigue. They experience moral distress, and I'll define that in a moment. But also what we see is an increasing number of care professionals actually experience burnout. And we also now experience permanent recruitment problems, despite the fact that care work in the Nordic welfare states are stable positions with pension rights and so on within the Nordic welfare states. So compassion fatigue is a serious business. It's about a reduced capacity to show empathy. And as I just said, empathy is part of doing care and of care. So that, of course, is very troubling. And what about moral distress? What is that? Moral distress is when it becomes impossible to provide the care required and in a good enough way. So moral distress arises when there is a disjunction between what the care professional thinks is good enough or good care and what the context on the conditions allows or thinks about care. So it's when the sort of ethical compass is out of sync with the sort of rest of the organization. They actually feel that they cannot provide good enough care, so they get very morally distressed. So this feeling of moral distress actually makes many care professionals leave the care sector. And what we also see from surveys is that an increasing number of professional carers actually are planning to leave. Some studies even show that half of the care professionals are planning to leave their jobs in the Nordic care sector. And that is regardless of what care you're talking about. It's kindergarten, it's crèches, it's old age care, it's nursing homes. So the recruitment problems are not just temporary. They might actually become endemic. So what we might end up with is that there, in the long run, is simply not sufficient professionals to staff the care institutions of the welfare state. And what also happens when a lot of people are turning sick or with burnout or actually leaving the sector, is that those left behind actually have an increasing workload, so to speak. So even in the Nordic welfare states, a care crisis is brewing in paid care work. And I'll just show you two examples where you can actually see this experience. So first, old age care, and this is from a survey, I think done in 19 or 20. So it was published in 22 by Annelies Strands from Stockholm University. And this is from a survey where care workers across the Nordic countries called Nordic could actually answer these surveys. And so one of them says about the work, it's physically and mentally demanding. I'm really afraid to forget things with users, feel I cannot cope with an increasing work pace. And another one says, it's because I can't give the care that my care recipients or users deserve. And because we are so controlled by the minute, stress, stress. They don't even have time to fill out the sentences, but just write stress, stress to sort of stress their feeling of lack of time. So this was in old age care. And the next one is I've just written down what surveys, but also observation studies and also interviews actually shows is that in creches and kindergarten, what the pedagogues and the professional carers actually increasingly feel is that their work days are just very, very hectic and the work is intensifying and they're doing several things at once and they cannot always be attentive to the needs. So sometimes if there is a child crying, they simply don't have time because in the other end, there are two children who are actually just about to get into a fight. So they actually had those very difficult positions of meeting the needs, but also of postponing the needs. So how can we look at this situation? And if we go to Ali Hochschild, an American sociologist, we can see that this sort of thin neoliberal care we can actually call that a kind of postmodern care. And it's a kind of postmodern care that sort of revamps care, but also downsizes it. And we can say that this postmodern ideal of care is based upon the dual breadwinner model, where women are sort of doing it all, and we don't really see major changes in the masculinities. So in this sense, postmodern care sort of becomes an ascetic ideal, what we in modern lingo would call reablement and autonomy, where there is this sort of self-responsibilization happening. So postmodern care is a kind of narrower ideal of care, where there is sort of stressing the responsibilities of the self. But it's not just postmodern, it's also a cold postmodern ideal of care. And the cold modern model sort of relies on impersonal institution where care increasingly becomes disengaged and depersonalized. Empathy and emotional involvement becomes unimportant. So if we combine these insights from neoliberalization and Hochschild ideal types, we could label the current situation in the Nordic to be postmodern and cold care. So care has been instrumentalized, standardized, and reformulated, and the care professional work at an intensified pace, attempting to keep up with all the tasks and the need. So policymakers in the Nordic welfare states have for a long time been concerned about how to finance the care. It's been sort of the political agenda for the last 20 years because of the silver tsunami and the changing demographic situation. So they've been very concerned about financing. But also within the last couple of years, they have also increasingly become concerned about recruitment. So such a situation framed as a crisis also becomes a situation for quick fixes. That could be the promotion of new technologies intended to reduce labor cost, but also to solve the recruitment problems. And these technologies are often hyped as magic bullets that would sort of change the situation and solve it overnight. But what we know from the literature on technologies, for instance, in old age care, is that the challenges of new technologies are often underrated. New welfare technologies like robot vacuum cleaners, intelligent floors in nursing home. Does everybody know what intelligent floors are? No? Intelligent floors in nursing homes are sensitive floors. So they actually register if the older person gets out of bed, but also if the elderly person actually falls, slips, right? So there is so intelligent floors is actually monitoring, for the better or worse, what the older person is actually doing. So the staff can actually know when somebody gets out of bed at night, which is a good thing because it could cause a fall on the floor. But it could also be stressing for the care professionals because every time somebody then gets out of bed, when they're not supposed to get out of bed, there is an alarm ringing. So these intelligent floors and robot animals feed into the care crisis by actually adding new tasks to the existing ones. So they're not the magic bullets they're supposed to be. They're actually reinforcing the crisis. Because what is not seen with these new technologies is that they're actually requiring a lot of hidden, invisible work of maintaining these technologies, but also adjusting the technologies to the person in question. So every technology. So just wrapping up, we see consequences of the care crisis at several levels, one at the micro level, but also one at the macro level. And at the micro level, we see that a lot of care professionals are experiencing moral distress, but also guilt. And as most of the care professionals are women, 80 to 90%, it's something that really hits the care professionals as women, but it also hits women as informal carers when the care blanket or the welfare state cannot provide sufficient care and sufficiently good enough care. So we also see at the micro level that those depending upon care don't receive the care that they're supposed to. So just wrapping up and getting at the macro level, we also note that the care crisis has serious consequences for the sustainability of the welfare state. When I talk about sustainability, it's about social sustainability, not the fiscal or the financial ones. Because what we see is that increasingly care professionals are opting out of the Nordic welfare state. And that, of course, is a serious problem because then there is less care, there is more discontinuous care. And so in this sense, the welfare state has a serious problem which sort of compromises the model in the long run. So we actually see that the Nordic welfare state has a problem, and we actually see that there are clear signs of a problem with social sustainability, and that this is something that the Nordic welfare state has to some extent to actually frame and relate to. Thank you very much.